Hi, I'm Tim. Welcome to Watchbox, and thanks for logging on. Today, Versus returns with a showdown between two of the Swiss luxury watch big three. It's Omega versus Breitling today on Versus. Let the games begin. All right, this is a showdown that has been a long time in the making because I first saw this watch at the beginning of 2020, and I thought, finally, we have a nice one-for-one comparison between an existing Omega product and a Breitling product, and it's not just a dive watch comparison. So let's talk about these two, starting with the watch that launched first. Here we have the Omega Speedmaster 57 Coaxial Chronograph. This launched at Basel World 2013, and it was one of Omega's first tentative steps in the direction of issuing a 1957-inspired Omega Speedmaster. The timepiece is 41.5 millimeters in stainless steel, 16.6 millimeters thick. From lug to lug, it is 50.1 millimeters, and if you include the end links, it's a little bit broader across the wrist at 54.3 millimeters with a 20 millimeter spacing between the lugs. So let's throw this one on my wrist. And you can see my wrist is 16 centimeters in circumference. This is a full-sized watch. I would say don't be deceived by the 41 millimeter size. 41.5, yes, but it wears more like a 43 or even a 44 on the wrist. It is a large timepiece, particularly because it's almost 17 millimeters thick. It doesn't quite disappear on the wrist the way a 41 normally would. So I would recommend this watch for a wrist no smaller than 15 centimeters circumference. And you can see, though it is quite thick, it's handsome. It's got a nice set of proportions. It doesn't look ungainly, just very large and substantial. Now, taking a look at the bracelet, you can see that there's a 3-link design that nevertheless manages not to cop the Rolex Oyster 3-link. The links themselves are rather short in cross-section. You can see that from the side. The flanking links are all of polish, side and top, and then the center links are of satin finish. Here we have a double deployant with a sequential close, one size closed before the other. And then that system is retained by two pushers, and the twin trigger release opens up the clasp. You can see there's an Omega logo externally, but there's nothing else going on here. The one detail I would draw your attention to is the set of screws that are used to fix the removable links. No pins and sleeves here, and take note, there is a half link that allows you to more finely size this, a half link on each side of the clasp. Now, this 1957 inspired watch is designed to reference the CK2915 of 1957, the first Omega Speedmaster. As a result, it doesn't have the lyre style lugs, nor does it have a taper to its lugs. It's squared off, minimally beveled. The lugs are very simple in profile. There's no crown guard or shear guard structure over on the crown side. You can see vintage inspired pump pushers, and you have a cantilevered bezel with a polished outer face, and then a satin finish on its top with a tachymeter scale. The tachymeter can be used to gauge the speed of, for example, a car over a mile or a kilometer. You use the chronograph to help gauge the speed of your target. So now the watch is a historic homage, but it is not a re-edition. It loosely parallels some of the design themes of yesteryear, but it is not a reissue type of watch. So this is very different from for example, the 1957 to 2017 trilogy series that came out in triplicate, the Railmaster, the Speedmaster, and the Seamaster in 2017. This is not like that. The dial includes the mono counter that's standard on the 9300 calibers. So you can see, though, it's a twin register dial. There's both chronograph minutes and chronograph hours on one register over at 3 o'clock. We have a construction that's rather like the sandwich dial found on Panerai, where you have these indices deeply sunken into a dial that is dark, somewhat faded with a matte finish. It's got a little bit of a coloration between black and tobacco, and then there's a sort of simulated fade fauxtina coloration to both the lume and the printing on the dial. The timepiece features polished hands. Note that the sub-registers include alpha-style hands, another vintage motif, along with the broad arrow hour hand. Turn it all over, you have caliber 9300 on the reverse side. 54 joules, bidirectional automatic winding, twin mainspring barrel, 60-hour power reserve. You have a column wheel, which you can see through a cutout in the bridge, and a vertical clutch system, so the engagement is very crisp. And then the chronograph can be started without stagger, and it can be run full-time without penalty, wear, tear, or hazard to your watch. That's the advantage of a vertical clutch. It is a full balance bridge for shock resistance with a free-sprung index for the same reason, and it uses a silicon anti-magnetic hairspring to significantly harden the watch against magnetism. As you can see, the timepiece is a chronometer, which means it is COSC certified, and it is a coaxial escapement, as envisioned by George Daniels back in 1974, industrialized by Omega in 1999, and really perfected today. It is both a long-legged power reserve increasing system and one that improves short-term and long-term timing precision. The watch is adjusted to 5 positions, and it includes both a hacking or stop seconds function and a unique time zone jumper, so you're able to jump the hour hand forward and backwards as you travel, while the chronograph, the minutes, everything else remains as it was undisturbed. It is a 100-meter water-resistant watch. Now let's talk about the Breitling. This one launched in 2020, but as with the Omega, it is a little bit of a historical nod without being a re-edition. This is a tribute to the 1984 Breitling Chronomat, which was developed through 1983 with the Italian military Frecce Tricolore, which is their aerobatic demonstration squadron, similar to the Red Arrows, the Blue Angels, or the Thunderbirds. And the Chronomat, which was launched in 1942 as a circular slide rule chronograph, was reborn in '84 after Breitling was revived by the Schneider family. It was revived as a chronograph with a little bit of an all-around sporting bent. Yes, a pilot's chrono, but here we have a unidirectional rotating bezel and 200-meter water resistance, so this could also be a diving chronograph. And it's very true to the original without being dated in the way many 80s designs can be. It's 42 millimeters in diameter by 15.3 millimeters thick by 50.5 millimeters lug-to-lug, and you can see that the end links are pivoted, so 50.5 millimeters lug-to-lug is the true distance across the wrist. Between being thinner and shorter across the wrist, there are some fit advantages here, and then 22 millimeters is the spacing between the lugs. One of the standout features of this watch, the Rouleaux Bracelet. Reimagined, it is a tribute to the 1980s, but with much better fit finish and solidity to it. You can see the Rouleaux is tapered. It's nicely detailed with a polished bevel along the sides of the short cross-section links. You have staggered intermediates. Note that you have these alternating polished bands, and that it is very silky on the wrist, wonderfully made, very substantial, physically impressive, and gorgeous to look at. This watch has period character and color without being dated in any regard. On my wrist, it feels more substantial, but I'll tell you, it also wears a little bit better. Even though the Omega on paper is a little bit smaller, this watch is thinner. It's also shorter across the wrist because of the absence of the solid end links. So I could recommend this watch for a wrist as small as about 14 centimeters in circumference. And it is a handsome piece, as you can see, very, very impressive. The timepiece includes bracelet construction that gives the Omega a little bit of an edge because pins and sleeves are used here for sizing the bracelet, which means that if you want to size this, a jeweler's screwdriver is not enough. You need a block and a punch. But the clasp is nicely made, and it's very similar to what you get with the Omega in that it is a double deployant with a twin trigger release system, but then it's not a sequential close. Either side can close first. You see the Breitling logo now shorn of its wings because Georges Kern, the CEO of Breitling since 2017, wants you to think of land, sea, and air sports when you see a Breitling watch, not just air. That's why there are no wings on the dial either. The case is thoroughly updated. This is not an anachronism. There's a lovely transitional bevel along the side, satin finishing profile. It's a cushion case. It's not really round. It's more of a cushion. And then it has these integrated and stubby lug profiles so that though a big watch, it wears well. There's a crown guard and shear guard structure on the crown guard. It does have a screw down crown, though not chronograph pushers. They're polished. The crown is the onion form that was distinctive of that original 1984 Chronomat. And then we have another Chronomat design feature here, a captive bezel held on by screws with rider tabs. The bezel is held on by screws so that you can't actually snap it off. It takes more time to assemble and disassemble it than a Rolex or Omega bezel, but it also makes it more impact resistant. This is a system also used by Zinn. And since that original Chronomat of the Schneider era, the rider tabs have been placed on the bezel so that you can more easily grip the bezel when your hands might be wet, sweaty, or gloved. Now this is let's have a listen. This is a 120-click dive bezel. It's unidirectional. Unlike a standard aviator bezel, it can't turn backwards and extend your dive. So you can time two things at once, one with the chronograph, one with the bezel. I actually prefer the bezel because the bezel measures up to 60 minutes, which I often find more useful than a chronograph, which only measures up to 30. The dial is of high quality. There's a tachymeter outboard. It too has one, but it also has the timing bezel, advantage Breitling. As you can see, there is a scale inboard of that serves as a rehot with individual Arabic numerals and hashes for reading the chronograph as well as the minutes hand. We have applied stainless steel rhodium-plated diamond polished indices, diamond tipped tools used to polish these indices. It is loomed. There will be a loom shot. You have these sunken registers in black with concentric patterns. And George Kern wants you to think in-house caliber when you see a modern day Breitling with a colored dial and a tone-on-tone set of registers. So different colored registers and dial, manufacture movement. There's a lovely little red varnished second sand for the chronograph that's handsomely counterweighted with the Breitling B, and I just like the look of this watch. You can see there's an instantaneous jumping minute register, which is one of the advantages of the caliber B01. Now, I can't show you a whole lot of the movement because there's a watch on a bracelet here. That's always one of the challenges when trying to show off a movement. When you've got a bracelet, you kind of have to do your best with the angle. But you saw the movement in the Omega, and if I had to opine, I would say the B01 is a better looking movement. It wasn't designed to be seen when it came out in 2009, also on the Chronomat series, but with the profusion of display casebacks under Kern's direction, we've realized just how good looking the B01 is. Now, it's also a column wheel and vertical clutch chronograph. You can see the column wheel in action. The vertical clutch bestows all of the same advantages it does on the Omega. This watch has hacking or stop seconds like the Omega, but it has a conventional quick set. There's not that mobile time zone jumping hour hand. This has a 72-hour power reserve. It's adjusted in 5 positions, and though it has a standard Swiss lever escapement, nevertheless, it is also a COSC certified Swiss chronometer adjusted in 5 positions. It beats away at 28,800 vibrations per hour, and I guess that's one of the differences. This is a 28.8 movement, this is 25.2, and that's simply a function of the way the coaxial works. No advantage in either, but this watch does have a conventional ferrous hairspring, whereas this one has a silicone hairspring. So let's start talking about advantages here. Okay. Advantages with the Omega. You've got that time zone function, which makes the watch a little bit handier if you do want to travel. It's just simply easier to jump time zones with that feature. Silicon. A silicon hairspring makes this watch almost amagnetic. That is very important in the high-powered electronic home and office environments of today. Bracelet construction. Though the rouleau feels just as solid, perhaps even more so, and it's more beautiful to behold, nevertheless, the screw-fixed links on this watch are an advantage over the pin and sleeve construction of the Breitling. That looks a little bit cheaper and is more difficult to size. Screws are the way to go on a modern luxury watch. 2-barrel stability. This watch has 2 mainspring barrels, which means after 24 or 48 hours, you're not going to see a big drop-off in balance amplitude and potential timing precision, whereas this watch, though it has a longer power reserve, has 1 mainspring barrel, which means there is going to be considerable fluctuation in mainspring torque, and there's going to be more of a drop-off in amplitude after 24 or 48 hours power reserve elapsed. So advantage Omega. With the Omega, you have a sharper feel to the column wheel. It's louder, it's snappier, it's more positive under the finger, and that's something you need to take into account. It's a big deal. I would also say realistically, the Speedmaster brand is probably a little bit stronger than Breitling Chronomat, so by a narrow margin, I would say this watch is probably the better one to wear if you want to wear the one that's going to be recognized. Now, let's talk about the Breitling. This gives you a diving bezel, which I consider to be a big advantage over the fixed tachymeter bezel of the Omega. Both of these have a tachymeter. This one just adds a diving bezel on top, which is wonderful for timing, and it's an absolute pleasure to operate. Total feel and substance. Everything about this watch feels more expensive than the Omega. The Omega is well made, no doubt, but this just feels indestructible in the hand. The bracelet, though fixed by pin sleeves, it feels like a battleship anchor. The case, there's a reason we have to set incompressible case settings when we water test Breitling watches in our watchmaking department. It's just because of the way it's constructed. From the captive bezel to the solidity of the case, to the screw-down crown, the bracelet, everything about this watch just feels, eyes closed, like it's the more expensive and premium product. Bracelet feel. Just as with the watch, the bracelet feels very well resolved. It looks good. It feels good. If I had to guess, eyes closed, I would say this is the more expensive watch just based on the bracelet alone. It's also more comfortable and, in my opinion, more attractive, but that will be subjective. I would also say it looks more special. Special is something that is rather fey and varies from person to person, but this just looks like it has a sense of occasion. Now, dial quality. I'm going to give the advantage to Breitling because of the applique, the polished treatment, the tone-on-tone, the depth of the dial, and the vibrancy of the sunburst, as well as the color combination. This feels a little bit hackneyed and rote. I don't feel like the world needs another Fotina dial. It's also somewhat flat and colorless. And if we're going to talk about dials, it's much easier to read the hour and minute registers on this dial because they get their own separate scales. It would be downright difficult to read, for example, the minute scale on this mono counter that features both hours and minutes. So on that basis, both a better looking dial and an easier dial to read on the Breitling. I'm also going to remind you guys that though this is a single mainspring barrel, it is a 72-hour power reserve versus a 60-hour power reserve, and that's a big difference. I would also say realistically, this watch fits more easily. Though it's a 42 and this is a 41.5, this watch is thinner, this watch is flatter, this watch is shorter from end to end because of the pivoted end links of the bracelet. So if you've got a slightly smaller wrist, I think the Breitling for once is going to be the one you pick, and I would never have said that previously. So this is a watch that in my opinion just gives you more. Since they both have the same warranty of 5 years, I have to declare this a narrow but clear win for the Breitling. You guys, let me know which of these two watches would you prefer to park in your collection and on your wrist. And we're back with the Breitling and the Omega by night. I'm going to say this is a tie. The Omega's a bit brighter, but the Breitling, if you note, looms every single hand on the dial, and you have that loomed bezel pearl. I'm also going to mention price. Price is in the Breitling's favor. The Breitling wins on a price basis, as the Omega retails for $9,000 and the Breitling retails for $8,100. Advantage Grenchen.